Thanks to Sean. I've been plenty of emails over the last 2 weeks just to get today up and running, and thank you all for coming on a wet Friday morning. So I'm going to start off today, but with us today as well we have Dr. John Mulvihill and Dr. Caithriona Yeomans with us as well, and we have Lauren Guilfoyle, Kilian, Bibby and Laura Power, who are PhD scholars on the IRFU project, and they're going to present on their work. So just to get going, their title is Injury Surveillance in Rugby, Enhancing Player Welfare. So the project this is all around is called the Irish Rugby Injury Surveillance Project, and myself and Professor Ian Kenny are the PIs of this project. And as we go through today, I'll discuss a little bit about the project, how it developed and where it's going to now. But the main, I suppose, sponsor of our project is the IRFU, and it started with funding from the IRFU. But it has grown with additional funding from the Irish Research Council, Erasmus+, UPMC and also from the HRI. So the plan for today's session, I'm going to introduce it, an overview of injury surveillance in the IRFU project. Lauren is going to come up then and talk about injury prevention in schools rugby. Kilian is going to talk about the incidence of breast injuries in female rugby, and he's hot off the press with a publication out yesterday in Sports Medicine, his first PhD publication, so congrats to Kilian. And Laura, who's just back from a research trip over in Pittsburgh, will talk about concussion treatment and recovery in amateur rugby. The PhD scholars will have a Q&A with the PhD scholars. John is going to talk about his work on concussion biomarker research, and he's done a number of years of data collection with the Munster professional rugby team. And then Caithriona, who was our first graduate from the Irish project, but is now the medical manager for the domestic game in the IRFU, will talk about how this research has translated and how it's been applied within the IRFU, which is, I suppose, a really key aspect of today, the translational impact of the work that has been done here since 2016. So why injury surveillance? Why do we survey and see what the injury is? Essentially, we do it so we can design effective injury reduction protocols, and we can try to minimize injury risk. We can't do that unless we know the status quo, the landscape, the incidence of injury and the cause of injuries. So we can see, I suppose, what's happening on the ground, and then we can look at policy and look at practices and make changes to try to offset those injuries, minimize the injury risk. And it's based about a model by Caroline Finch, who is one of the key researchers globally in injury surveillance. And it's around this TRIP model, which is translating research into injury prevention practice. And the first step of that is injury surveillance. What is the status quo? What is the injuries like? Then it's establishing the mechanism, the causes of injury, developing preventative measures, looking at feasibility studies, and then eventually rolling that out in implementation strategies within the implementation context through randomized controlled trials. And we're working through the model as we progress through this project. But first, I'm going to put you in the spot. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to go onto menti.com and type in that code. And yes, Lauren definitely knows the answer because this is our area. What injury do you think last season carried the highest injury burden? Now, what I mean by burden is the injury that had the highest incidence, but also had the players out for the longest period of time. So it's one thing knowing the most common injury, but we also need to know what are the injuries. I better put up the sheet so we can see what's coming up. We also need to know what are the injuries that are having players out for the longest period of time, that are most severe. So what do you think are the most burdensome injuries in schools rugby? So we have shoulder, knee, ankle, neck and concussion, knee, shoulder, concussion, head, knee. Super. Give you another few minutes. Okay, so there'll be 23 responses there. I can tell you that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people are right out of the 23. The one that causes the greatest issue last year was shoulders, shoulder dislocations and subluxations. So that was the greatest injury burden. So I want you to use guinea pigs, is that there's a huge variety up here. There's knee, there's ankle, there's concussion, there's wrist, there's shoulder. Unless we do proper injury surveillance, we're just shooting in the dark. We don't know what we're supposed to be targeting. We don't know what we're trying to prevent or what we're trying to target. And that's the real importance of injury surveillance. So we get accurate, objective data coming back to us. So thank you for doing that. And when we have that, we can see that the injury with the greatest prevalence, the greatest burden was shoulders, followed by concussion, followed by the ankle sprain. And that's something we've seen, and Lauren can talk to this, in that age group. And then we can target that by having prevention strategies, which Lauren's work is on, and trying to target those areas. So it shows real importance of injury surveillance. And it was one of the drivers for the IRFU in initially calling for tenders for this area, because they did not know what was happening in the amateur game in Ireland. Our research is all around the amateur and schools game. And that was a big driver for it. It was no longer pub talk anymore. They had real solid data that could drive their policies after that. So a quick overview of IRIS. It was established in 2016 through funding from the IRFU. The first phase went from 2016 to 2022 and it funded 2 PhD students. Caithriona was the first graduate and Therese Leahy. In 2023, we agreed a phase 2 of the project with the IRFU that would take us to 2030. So by the time we get to 2030, it's 14 years, and the IRFU have to be complimented for committing to that period of time for research in this area. The funding has also been supplemented significantly by Erasmus Plus funding, which allows us to travel to South Africa this year. HRI have funded a PhD scholar. The IRC have funded 2 PhD scholars, and 1 we got positive news this week. So we'll have an IRC scholar join us in September, and also a postdoc. And UPMC, the healthcare provider, have funded Laura's work, and that she just commenced in January. The total funding equates to $2.5 million since we commenced to date. Our aims are to develop an injury surveillance system so we can collect, we can track and do trend analysis of injuries to identify possible injury causes and then develop preventative measures and strategies, and ultimately to enhance the health and welfare of rugby union players in Ireland. And Caithriona will talk to that work of how it has been applied within the IRFU. It is a multidisciplinary team. While myself and Ian are the PIs, we have researchers from across the faculties in UL. Roisin Callan from Allied Sciences, Mark Campbell, Mark Lyons, Drew Harrison and Giles Warrington from PES, John Mulvihill from School of Engineering, Kieran O'Sullivan from Allied Sciences, and from School of Medicine, Liam Glynn. And our current PhD scholars are Lauren presenting today, Kilian and Laura, and Dara Curran is with us from Allied Health in the audience today, and Dara started last week with us as well. So by the time we get September, we'll have 5 current PhD scholars on the project. So what has been the impact really of IRIS so far? Our results have directly impacted policy and practice within the IRFU and World Rugby. Our results are fed up to the IRFU through a national report every year, and we also report up to World Rugby, and it impacts what is happening globally and nationally. We're the first long-term injury surveillance project in the women's game, and we're proud of that fact, that we have a big focus on the females game, and Kilian's work and his research published this week is groundbreaking. It hasn't been done before, and we're leading the work in that area. IRIS this year is part of a global trial, and many of you probably know that there is a change in the tackle height in the domestic, the underage, the amateur game, and it varies where the line is, but the IRFU line is essentially a belly line. Just below the sternum is the tackle height. That's where you have to tackle below that height, and if you don't, then that is a penalty. Multiple countries are involved in this study. It will cover 13,000 matches, 200,000 tackles, and we're part of a 2-year global trial on this, and Dara's work will directly link into that. We have 19 journal publications, 54 conference publications, and we have 4 PhD graduates to date. And we have key international collaborators in South Africa and, very importantly, with a big concussion network in Pittsburgh. I suppose for me, the IRIS, a big impact of it, it's been a really effective model for developing impactful research that has a huge translational impact, but also building capacity and attracting funding. While the IRFU have significantly funding this project, we have got like 4 or 5-fold funding from other funders to add to the project. And when you have a project that is producing outcomes, is well established, it's easier to attract other funding into it. And it's been a really nice model for that. And for me as well, it's been an excellent model for developing research scholars and PhD scholars. So we have 4 graduated, we have 5 on the books, and we have funding for 2 more. At minimum, by the time we get to 2030, we'll have had 11 PhD scholars. Actually, I'm wrong there. We'll have had 13 PhD scholars through the programme. So it's been a nice model for that as well. So just to give you an idea of numbers, so each year we do the surveillance in the men's amateur divisions, in the women's game in Ireland amateur, and in the schools game. We have about 40 teams in total that we involved in the IRIS system each year. And we have about 1,500 players. So that's the group that we will survey. That surveillance happens every year. The only year it was broken was because of COVID. And aligned to that, then we have individual research projects aligned to the PhD scholars' focus of work. So Lauren will be on school, Kilian more focused on the women's injuries, Laura will focus on concussion, and Daria will focus on the tackle height. So individual projects will feed off it. Just to get an idea of the system, when we started, we had no system. Other countries use a pen and paper method, which has a really low compliance rate. So we developed our own bespoke system. So it's a web-based system. And this is exactly, this is everything Caithriona did with her PhD, was on developing this system. In each club, there's an injury recorder who is responsible for uploading the injuries. And of course, we have consent from players, underage players, we have parental or guardian consent. The injury recorders log the injuries on the system as they happen, and we follow World Rugby and IRC consensus statements on what defines an injury. The log stuff like location, type, nature, and so on. The PhD scholar keeps in regular contact with the injury recorders, and we do a weekly audit to check is the data coming in accurate? Is there any serious injuries coming in? If a club has been inactive for 2 weeks, we go and we target that club and say, have you any injuries? And because of that, we have regularly over 90% compliance each year on the injuries coming in. So we can be very solidly say that we have accurate, objective and data that is definitely reflective of what is happening out there. Each year, the data is collated, analysed, and report is written. We go to graphic designers, it's packaged, and it's sent to the IRFU and released out on a press release every year. And you see example of the reports there. The PhD scholars are lead all that process. So at the moment, Lauren and Kilian are the authors of that, and we would obviously, consult with them, but they are the lead authors on that publication. So this example of the graphics that you'll see in it. This is the on the left here we have the men's game, on the right the women's game, and we will see the injuries to males and forwards and backs, and to the individual positions, the percentage of injuries. This is another example of a graphic. So we look at the body location. Again, on the left we have the men, and on the right we have the women's game. And you'll see last year the head had the highest incidence of injury, followed by the shoulder and the ankle. And for the women, it was the knee, followed by the ankle. So my last slide is just give you an overview of what the system looks like. This is the test side of it. We'll have our players on the side here. And then you'll see if the injury is clear or whether it's an active injury, like the sprain injury that's there. And they can be cleared later on when they have come back to play. We add players, we get information, such as their height, their weight, any medical conditions, their position, the years playing rugby, and we gather information maybe on some strength metrics. And then when you go to an injury, you would click on the player, you have their profile at the top, you have their injury profile. Again, this is just test data. And we'll see how long they were out for. Knowing the duration is very important because that tells us about the severity. And then to add an injury, you literally will go into the add injury, and then we add information such as what was the match type, when did it occur, the occurrence, was it a match or training, and what time of the match, what was the mechanism of injury, Were they wearing protective equipment? Where was the location? What was the nature? What was the treatment? What is the diagnosis? And then that injury is logged on our system. So it takes only 3 or 4 minutes for an injury recorder to upload that information. So that's a quick overview of the system and the project. To delve in a little bit more into individual aspects of it, I'm going to hand over to Lauren now, and she's going to talk to us about injury prevention in schools rugby. Thanks, Lauren.
Good morning. I have a touch of a chest infection, so I apologise in advance if I get croaky. But thanks very much for coming here today, and to Tom for that very quick overview. So hopefully what I lead on to here has been explained so far, in so much as how we collect that data itself. So I look after the schools rugby injury surveillance, and just for some context, the schools rugby game in Ireland, it's approached differently to maybe how GA in a schools environment is approached, in that most players, most young players will either play with a club or with a school. They very often don't play with both. And to be quite honest, schools rugby is taken very seriously by those young players. That picture there is from the Leinster Senior Cup final that is held in the RDS every Paddy's Day. And as you can see, the entire parish is present there for that game. So each provincial province runs their own senior cup competition, and this is the most elite of those schools competitions. It offers playing opportunities to players from about 17 to 19 years of age, and each of those senior cups are held in Leinster, Connacht and in Munster, given that the school system in the north of Ireland obviously is run slightly differently. So it's this competition that we collect data from. We have collected some data in the past from the Junior Cup system, which is an under-17 competition, but my focus is really on the Senior Cups, this under-19 competition. And the top line data point that I suppose, if we were to very, very quickly summarise our injury surveillance, is the injury incidence per 1,000 hours. This gives us a very comparable figure across different competitions, given schools rugby games are 70 minutes in duration. And as you can see there, the schools competition, we see about 38.5 injuries per 1,000 hours of those games. It's slightly lower than what we have in the adult community game here in Ireland, so the AAL on the very left of the screen. And then we also see some figures there for some other competitions. So your senior international, professional and international under 20 competitions. But that just is the top line data. As Tom alluded to, we need to understand the types of injuries that are occurring, how severe they are, where they're occurring, and how those injuries are occurring as well. So as I mentioned, 38.5 injuries per 1,000 hours. But we do know from our data collection that about 2/3 of all injuries are as a result of the tackle. And it's the tackler that tends to come off the worst in those tackle events. We also know that about 1/5 of all injuries are occurring to the head, but we also need to target the shoulder, the knee and the ankle, and that's a very similar injury profile that we see in the adult game as well. And also Tom stole my thunder there with regards to the burden of shoulder dislocations. It isn't just about the injuries that are occurring most frequently. We also need to consider the ones that are keeping players out of the game for the longest duration, and shoulder dislocations are consistently coming up top of that list, so it's a priority. What we do with that data, as Tom alluded to again, is we need to inform our injury prevention or our injury reduction strategies, and Engage is the readiness and robustness programme of the IRFU. So my colleague Patrick Dolan, in collaboration with the IRFU medical department, have developed Engage, which I suppose if we were to take a colloquial term would be our warm-up, but it definitely doesn't need to occur as just a warm-up within a session. So this is a neuromuscular training programme that's comprised of various drills and exercises. 3 main components: readiness, robustness and performance. And if you want to take your phone out and scan the QR code there, it'll bring you to more information about Engage itself. But the optimal dosage for this programme, and indeed any neuromuscular training programme really at the moment, is about 15 minutes of exposure 3 times per week. We do have some preliminary data from the AAL, so from the adult game at the moment. We don't have a full efficacy trial done just yet. But I suppose across the board in youth field sports, we do see a pretty big impact of these programmes on injury. So if we're exposed once per week, We're seeing about a 25% reduction in lower extremity injuries. And as you can see, as the exposure goes up, the injury incidence comes down. So that, I suppose, is the foundation of my work, and it's how do we get people to do these more often, because the best injury prevention strategies are the ones that are actually done. We could have the best program in the world, but if it's not actually completed, we're not going to see the actual benefits of it. So we have one really good example from the rugby context, because we don't actually have too much research in this area just yet, so we're very much on this hot topic. But Activate is another example which was developed by the University of Bath along with the England Rugby Union, and it's a very similar program. And back in 2015, I had the extra slides there, they're not popping up, but back in 2015 this was trialled, and it showed some pretty brilliant results, but those pretty brilliant results were only derived from 7 teams. They had 44 teams in the trial, and the only reason, I suppose, those brilliant results applied to just 7 teams within that trial is that only 7 teams were actually able to achieve 3 exposures per week. So this is where the implementation focus comes in, being able to get people to do this more frequently. And you could argue at that point maybe they didn't know how good it was going to be, the benefits of it, but it was followed up a couple of years later. And of the 290 schools across England that were invited, only 4.5% of those actually participated, and then only half of those again actually were able to achieve 3 exposures per week. So just because it works, it doesn't mean it's going to actually be done. So what am I doing about it? The first thing I want to do is establishing, well, what's the current approach? What are people doing to support the people that are delivering this to their players? And in most instances, this is going to be a coach. They're the person that has the most influence over your team's activities. So I conducted a scoping review that was recently published, and our top line summary really is that it's once-off pre-season workshops tends to be the approach that's taken so far. Then I wanted to know, well, what do coaches actually want? They're the people that are going to be delivering this program. As researchers, we can, take a different approach, but what do they actually want? And coaches want live, interactive and practical education. They also want this education to facilitate some peer learning. They do actually want workshops, so it's good that is what's being offered, and they'd love that to be at their own site or close by, and obviously the scalability of that has to be considered. They want that workshop to really address the development of their own implicit knowledge of the program. So instead of giving them a program and do it this way every single time you do it, they want to be able to understand it to the point that they can develop it or modify it for their own context. They really want resources to support the delivery of that, and they really want those resources to help them plan their sessions. So a really good characteristic about the Engage programme is that there is variability within it. You don't have to do the exact same exercises all the time. You can pick and choose and change, and players really love that variability. It takes away the boredom element of it. But they don't have any consensus on who should facilitate these workshops, which is good from a scalability perspective. All they ask for is that the person is qualified, they can answer questions, and that they can speak to them in a way that they understand. So what are we doing with this information? We're just about to roll out a feasibility trial of some components of an implementation plan, because they can be quite big. So we're zoning in on 3 components that are related to coach competency. The first of that is a 2-part workshop series, and that's going to be informed by the health action process approach. The second part is a planning tool that's bespoke that will help them to plan their sessions, and will also be backed up with some coach focused resources. And the last part is an opt-in follow-up support. So that's one key part that seems to be missing from what's being delivered at the moment, is that we have the capacity to answer questions as they actually do this within their contexts within the season. And most of our outcome measures are really going to be about feasibility at this moment in time. And that's me in a nutshell, 4 years down to a couple of slides. Thanks very much. I'll just pass it over to my colleague, Kilian.
Thank you. Hi everyone. So I'm going to present on my research, and I'm just going to talk you through what we have done, or what I have done so far, and what the future may hold. So my topic is incidence of breast injuries in female rugby, and the subtitle here is a silent injury. So to start off, I want to talk about my content, so where we started, then followed by what we did, then what is missing, and then finally what we plan to do on changing those those facts. So where we started. So the preliminary research, or the preliminary investigation to find the research gap in women's rugby was when I started my PhD just about a year ago in January 2023. And so we identified contact breast injuries, CBIs, here among female rugby players as such gap. Just to give a bit of context, a CBI occurs when the breast is struck with blunt force. So let's say you're being tackled, or you hit the ground, or you're being hit by the ball. So there's currently only one paper published investigating contact breast injuries in rugby environment. So to sum it up, we started with very little on the topic itself. What we did, so we started with that systematic literature review, what Tom just mentioned, which just got published, which is contact breast injuries among female athletes. So we looked at all sports with the following results. So we have those different sports here. We have non-contact sports, basketball, volleyball, contact combat sports, soccer, water polo, AFL, softball, and rugby codes. As we can see, the occurrence of contact breast injuries during the whole career was the highest in rugby codes. Hereby is to mention that this included 7s, 15s, and league, just as an extra point there. One component that's really important here, so that's the occurrence of the contact breast injury during the current career. So the time frames of those studies differ significantly. So the best example here, or as an example on why then comparisons are difficult. So if you take the basketball, which is the only sport where 2 studies on that topic exist. So the yellow bar is of American college basketball players, while the pink bar is of French professional basketball players. So we ask ourselves the question, there's a difference of 20%. Why is that? Is that because the professional basketball players play at a higher level? Is it because they've been exposed to the sport itself for a longer period? So simple as we don't know. Yeah. Other points, then other key findings which we unraveled in the systematic review are between 0 to 42.9% of the contact breast injuries were reported. Of those, the treatment rate ranged between 0 to 50% of those that were reported, and under 3% utilized breast protective equipment. So what was the next step we did? So we then ourselves decided on an international survey on the experience and knowledge of and with breast injury among female rugby union players, gathering 483 responses out of 29 different countries. So just to compare this, so this was an international study, while all of those studies on the slide before were national studies in one country. Our results are the following. To mention here as well, so we looked at rugby union, which was 7s and 15s. We can see that our injury rate was 20% less than the other rugby study, which involved league. I did criticize this just before on the slide, that we just looked at the occurrence of breast injuries during the current career. So what we did on top is we asked about the frequency over the past 12 months, just to get a bit of more detail here. Again, the problem is there's no inter-sport comparison because that hasn't been done yet. So we don't know what those numbers will tell us. It's an average of 2.4 contact breast injuries in those last 12 months. Other key points we did find in our survey was the general unawareness of medical complications breast injury can cause. Under 25% of the respondents were likely or very likely to report the injury. In less than 9% of the reported cases, treatment was provided, and reporting barriers consisted of injury unawareness, topic delicacy, or the fear of reduced game time. So what is missing? So the perspective of the support staff. So most of those studies, or bar one, looked only at the player's perspective. So coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, S&Cs, physios are the ones that also need to be looked at. Stakeholder education, so all over education of all participants, prospective data collection, and that's a really big one. So all of those numbers we just showed you through IRIS is all because it is prospective data collection, and all of that previous work, and this includes my work itself, is retrospective data and retrospective data collection. So prospective data collection is really important just to see what this injury is about. So information on injury severity and incidence will follow with that, and then more detailed insight into injury mechanism. So what do we plan? So we are planning interviews with coaches, physios, S&Cs, and players. We'll start with those next week. Thanks to Lauren there for helping out as well. With this information, we're going to get through those interviews. We plan to educate those coaches, physios, SNCs and players on the importance and relevance and necessity of reporting and recording breast injuries. We then want to utilize the IRIS project, the running IRIS project, with prospective injury data collection on this injury type through the 24-25 season to then analyze this injury data regarding the identified missing information to then hopefully have more detail on this type of injury. And that will bring me to my final slide, which is just my final words on the topic. So there's a high demand of education on the topic. Continuous prospective injury reporting and recording will help to answer questions, and prevention strategies can be developed through detailed injury knowledge in general. Thank you very much. Hand over to Laura. I'll just squeeze through.
Hi, thank you very much everybody for coming today. My name is Laura and I am the newest PhD student on the IRIS project here, so it's been brilliant to get involved in. And my focus is on concussion and amateur rugby. And sports-related concussion is quite a hot topic, both in the media and in research as well. And there's been a big surge in research in the last while, so because I'm actually so early on in my research myself, I'm going to lead this by talking a little bit about my research plans at the end, but to start, just talking about some important and interesting points in concussion research progression in general, and then concussion in Irish rugby as well. So to start, if anyone here doesn't know what a concussion is, which is absolutely okay, it is a sports-related concussion, and it's a traumatic brain injury caused by a direct blow to the head, neck or body, resulting in an impulsive force being transmitted to the brain that occurs in sport and exercise-related activities. Symptoms and signs may present immediately or evolve over minutes or hours, and commonly resolve within days, but may be prolonged. And I think that this being the overarching definition of concussion, it's in the consensus statement, that in itself is actually a huge progression in concussion research, because I think the old school approach of concussion is somebody gets a big knock, it's really dramatic, there's a blackout, it's immediate symptoms. But we know now that that's not necessarily it. A lot of concussions can actually be a lot more subtle than that. You can actually get symptoms hours later that are to do with the blow you got maybe in a match that morning. So the ability to diagnose accurately and manage appropriately something that doesn't present as that old school or traditional approach is huge. Another thing that has progressed hugely in terms of concussion research is the management, especially in the acute phases. So if we're going with that old school approach, there's this big dramatic incident, and then you're probably going to wrap that player in bubble wrap, put him in a dark room, no screens, don't talk to anybody, and just hope that those symptoms get better kind of on their own. It was a very passive approach, and this is a systematic review and meta-analysis just published last year, so it's very recent, to show that rest is actually not best. And research has shown that early activity can reduce recovery time by almost 5 days. So if you're thinking of people trying to get back to sport, but also just work and school and just activities of daily living that they're inhibited by their concussion, being able to get back to those things 5 days earlier is huge. But it is important to note here that too little and too much exercise led to prolonged recovery. So I'm in no way promoting people going back to play the game that day or the day after. There is a happy medium between the two, which I think is important to note. In terms of concussion in amateur rugby in Ireland, there's a paper published by Caithriona, who you'll hear from later, and to talk about the prevalence, so just how often it's popping up in Irish rugby. That it was previously found to be the most common match day injury for male and female, and the most recent report shows that it is the most prevalent injury for 20% of male match day injuries and 8% of female. So it is coming up quite frequently. But again, as Tom alluded to earlier, that's not the same as injury burden, it's just how often it is coming up. And just so everyone's aware, if you get concussed while playing for an Irish rugby team, under IRFU regulations, over the age of 20, you have a 21-day mandated sit-out period, so you can't play for 3 weeks. And for those slightly younger athletes of under 20, it's 23-day mandated sit-out period, during which time people should be doing a gradual return to play protocol. So injury or concussion should be rehabbed like any other injury, basically. I know there's a lot going on the screen here, but I just like to bring everyone's attention to the left-hand side, where you can just see the 6 gradual return to play phases. So there's a lot of systems being rehabbed during this 21 or 23-day period. So you're talking about aerobic fitness, resistance, balance, and so on. But to make this makes sense, it basically gets progressively harder. So if you're talking about the aerobic system, people would start off on an exercise bike, progress then to jogging, probably at a higher heart rate for a longer duration, then onto running, and then onto what me and most athletes would call the fun stuff. So going into more non-contact drills, but rugby specific. So people feel like they're really coming out the other end and they can really see the light at the end of the tunnel. Then full contact practice, and then full return to play. So the idea is that after that mandated sit-out period, people go back being both physically and I would argue even more importantly mentally prepared, that they've been exposed to all the movement demands since their concussion and they go out entirely confident in playing the match. And what my research plans to add to the field is basically what's happening during that mandated sit-out period in Irish amateur rugby. So the finer details are actually still being finalised, but this is just an idea of what's probably going to be looked at. One of the main ones being, are people doing the gradual return to play? So do people just believe that they're better after 21 days and they take a 3-week holiday, or have a good time over the weekends because they're not playing? It's something that we're really interested in to see the compliance to it. Again, maybe we'll look at who is leading the gradual return to play. So is there access to a medic to actually lead it and make sure that everybody is following it step by step? And then also symptoms. So symptoms are a really important one because the type of symptoms you have, whether you have a headache or nausea or blurred vision, that actually can all point you in the direction of better treatment and more individualized treatment for your concussion. So if we know what symptoms people are having, we can basically place them into a concussion. It's called a clinical profile. So this on the left are basically categories of concussion. So concussion isn't a one-size-fits-all injury. The same way that if you hurt your knee, it's not always an ACL or it's not always a meniscus, it just depends. Concussion is the exact same. So if you look at these clinical profiles, I have 6 here. So this is the most used, I suppose, in research at the moment, but it's recently been changed to 5. So the most common clinical profiles that we'll see will be anxiety and mood. Vestibular. So vestibular is like the ear system. So if you think like really busy, loud environments or really rapid head movements, that would make people's symptoms worse. You have ocular motor, which is your eyes, which would be eye strain. So looking at a screen for a long period of time, any rapid eye movements, which is very typical in returning to play if you're trying to follow a rugby ball or your opponent across the pitch. Cognitive, so the inability to focus if you're returning to work or school as well, and post-traumatic migraine. And then when you're looking at cervical, that and sleep are now seen as a modifier, so they're not primary concussion clinical profiles, but they are, you just need to know about them as well because they may affect the clinical profiles. And dependent on this, you can get individualized treatment. So if you are someone who has unfortunate prolonged symptoms that you're not recovering in the expected time frame, there is rehab that you can do. So examples are behavioral changes, exposure to symptom triggering activities, like going into busy shops and schools. So if they are aggravating you, to basically do gradual exposure to them, the same way that if you hurt your knee, you'd work on going to full depth in a squat. It's the exact same, but just getting used to busy environments. You can do physiotherapy and then pharmacological intervention as well. And then the two probably that people don't know most about is vestibular therapy and exertion therapy. So I was lucky enough to go over to Pittsburgh there at the beginning of April, and I got to shadow in their concussion clinic for 2 weeks, which was just incredible to see. So vestibular therapy is if you have, just to explain that a little bit, if you have that vestibular system, then that's affected by the concussion. So you find that your ear, the ear system basically is affected. There is certain like balance exercises you can do, but there's also different things that if you have rapid head movement side to side, that's provoking your symptoms, you can actually rehab that. So you might start with a metronome with a really slow rhythm. So you're tilting your head very slowly and that would progressively get faster. And then you could also add in a busy environment behind the person or get them walking or doing an activity during it. So you're gradually, again, exposing those symptoms that the concussion has affected and then getting them better from there. It's back to day-to-day activities or sporting events. Exertion therapy is more to do with the workout and sport side of things. So it's to make sure that you're able to do all of those movements that are affecting you and maybe exacerbating your concussion symptoms and working them into a workout. So I'm going to keep going with the example of rapid head movements. So by doing that, you'd get a workout plan that maybe has planks with a rotation. So you're actually working out and being physically active while stimulating that system in the attempt for the system basically to calm down a little bit. So I just thought that was really interesting to know that there is different rehab for different types of concussion. And there is a concussion network from EPMC in Ireland now, but it's obviously just a different scale between the States and here because it's just been around longer. So I thought it was a good point just to educate everyone on that, if you didn't know. And then just a summary, I suppose, the research goals, they're all player welfare focused. It's all about optimising a safe return to play for the players. hopefully allowing for more active approaches and avoiding the negative effects of that full rest approach, like social isolation if you took that cocooning approach, which would be staying in the room, not talking to anyone, no screens, etc. And then also maybe to help advise practitioners. So there's very little research in this population currently. So if we could add just a little bit of research into that body of literature to help practitioners to care for those athletes a little bit better, that would be a huge win for us. So that concludes my presentation anyway.
So we might just take this opportunity after the three PhD scholars, maybe have any questions specifically to the PhD scholars before we go on to a little bit more detail from Caithriona and from John. But just, I suppose, the IRIS project has been exceptionally lucky to have exceptionally talented PhD students throughout our period of time, and every one of them have shown that to us. I think that the success of the project definitely stems down to the quality of PhD students that we have. So, any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Carla Sullivan. So I come at this from both sides. Sorry. So I'm the health research officer in UL, but I am also the women's rugby coordinator with UL Bows. It's just a question to note on, I think I showed you on your first slide, Tom, there was 4 female clubs actively maybe involved in the IRIS project at this stage. And then looking at Kilian's next phase of his research, where he's to go out and actively interview and interact with clubs, there seems to be, I suppose, a certain level of, I don't know if the word is apathy or disengagement on the club perspective to become involved in this research. And I'm just wondering, and maybe this is a question for Caithriona later on, but what can we do as researchers or volunteers in club that can actually educate more as to the necessity of female-specific research so that Kilian's research can progress and we can get meaningful data going forward?
Yeah, Kilian, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hope. Oh, sorry, I just got to my phone. Yeah, hopefully with those interviews and then the developed education piece, we will have some platform to go to the clubs with. Obviously, there's also just the networking and talking to the people and just proving and showing the necessity of it. I did a lot of recruiting and sometimes it is difficult because some people, as you said, might not see the necessity of doing it. They think it's a burden of doing that extra logging of the injuries. So yeah, selling the system is probably something we need to put a bit more emphasis on it. Yeah,
and I think we need to look at maybe how we structure it even from the IRFU perspective. There's financial incentive given to clubs to participate in WAIL. I know you can't mandate research, but I think there needs to be some link to the supports that they're getting versus the feedback that they give.
Yeah, that's definitely something we're looking at the moment as well, yeah.
So I might just add on that I suppose we've been, in the men's side, we've been very lucky in getting the teams in. The females, it's a little bit more of a struggle. But there are incentives which are, I suppose, obviously approved through ethical procedures as well. So there are actually financial incentives for clubs with regard to insurance payments. If club takes part, they get 2 out of their 6 insurance payments paid by the IRFU in this. So, and we have purposely designed a system so the burden is minimised as much as possible. But yeah, we're very keen to work with the IRFU and the female clubs because I suppose we have developed data for a number of years and we really want to drive that, and we're passionate about trying to get all the clubs of the female at that high-end amateur level into the pro level into the project for sure. No problem.
I'm just curious, I suppose Hi, so my name's Margaret Lawler and I'm from the research office, the tech transfer office. And I suppose my question is coming from, I work with scouts, not rugby players, but how many, would they have first aid treatment, training, would they, because I suppose if you're for coaches, if you're to recognise, to treat injuries and to even recognise it, you need to actually be able to recognise that there's an injury. And the same for players. It's like to report properly, you need to actually be able to recognise that you have an injury and the potential seriousness of your injury. And I'm just curious, what's the level of first aid knowledge among clubs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's probably something that might crop up a little bit more at the schools level, just because we don't have, or those schools might not have access to medical personnel at all times, or they wouldn't be present at sessions. So it is something that we have considered, and the IRIS platform itself is set up to be as user friendly as absolutely possible. And as well, to note, we use the word injury quite a bit, but we take all, I suppose, even if it's a niggle but they're continuing to play, that can be logged. If it's an injury that takes a week out of the game, that gets logged, and we analyse that differently. So even if there is different, I suppose, understandings from the injury recorder's perspective as to what an injury should be or what should be logged, we basically ask them to log everything, and then we can decide what gets analysed and what not. But the IRIS system that Tom briefly brought you through earlier, basically we don't ask the injury recorder to type or to give us detail. We give you an option of, these are the locations, pick which one is the most appropriate. So the knee, we don't need to know that it's the ACL or the MCL, because you just tell us it's a ligament. And we also have two different points of injury or of data input, because in some instances, the person or the player hasn't seen a physio yet, because you aren't a physio, so you don't know. So you input the data at one point, and then at the very end, there's just a very quick line, because sometimes that information has changed, so you input it there. At that point, that's where our injury data audit comes into play. So we audit that data week to week. So as a physiotherapist myself, if I'm reading it and it just doesn't add up, that's where I would reach out to the injury recorder themselves, get a little bit more information. And again, at the end, if the diagnosis has slightly changed, or what they've input has slightly changed, I then go back through that trail of data and basically make sure it all makes sense from our perspective. And if I need to reach out at that point to get a little bit more information, that can happen. So I suppose we've tried to make it as user friendly as possible. I think this season I might have 2 or 3 physios looking after the data input from the school's perspective. The rest are all teachers, they're all coaches. So it's made to be as user friendly as possible, and you don't need to have a medical degree or first aid training to be a part of it. Long-winded answer.
I'm sorry, Frederica, I work in the research office. So just a quick question just to add to that point on schools rugby. Do you find that schools are they anonymous when they disclose injuries?
So we've again tried to utilise the system such that the IRIS platform is as beneficial for the school as it is for us. So the schools themselves use the system as a way to log their injuries as and when they happen. So they input the data under that player's name, and the player has consented to do that along with their parent or guardian. And when that data comes to us, it's then recognised by an injury ID. It's no longer a player's name or a player's ID. So then when that injury then makes it into our overall report, it's not possible to actually identify the player or even the school at that point.
Okay. No, because I was just wondering because I know you see it happening, especially in schools rugby, where they're probably down as injured, but they've played the following week, probably shouldn't have.
Well,
and you see it, so that's the only reason I was asking, are they actually disclosing fully their injuries, because they probably wanted them to play the following week?
Yeah, well, I think in any injury surveillance, there probably is an element of we're not going to catch absolutely everything. I was an injury recorder myself. From a concussion perspective, if a concussion is reported, the IRFU do monitor player team sheets, and there are consequences, for the want of a softer word, if a player returns to play too early.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Question here? Yeah. Just in front here,
yeah. Just a quick question. In terms of implementing this database or model within the professional game, has it been rolled out within the professional game in terms of Munster rugby?
Yeah, so I'll let Caithriona answer that. Caithriona, jump up there. You're best place for this one.
No problem. So when we developed IRIS, and I said I was the first PhD researcher, so I developed this web-based system that we look at now, it was very much given with the context of what domestic game looks like and what the resources would be and how we can make it most user-friendly and also impactful within that cohort. In the professional game, we have a similar system. So we have an athlete management software which would look after injury, player like GPS data, wellness scores. So we do have a system that we do there. We don't publish the reports, we use them internally. There may be a day where we do start publishing them in like the group over in Bath do, so they have their professional rugby and their community rugby injury surveillance that they publish every year. At the moment we don't, but we do have that system ongoing.
We might take one more question, Tommy has, just before we go on to John and Caithriona's presentation.
Thanks, Tom. And Lauren, in your data, it was great, all excellent presentations, by the way. Just in your data, you showed that the incidence of injury per 1,000 hours, I think, in the AIL and schools rugby was, say, about half of that in pro club or in the Rugby World Cup 2019. I would have thought it might be somewhat higher in the AIL and in schools rugby because, say, of poorer conditioning or poorer technique compared to the elite players in terms of the brilliance of their conditioning and the excellence of their technique. So that was quite heartening. I wonder then, within the AIL, did you drill down to see players within divisions 1, 2, 3 and 4? Did the incidence of injury become higher? And because I'm just thinking in terms of conditioning and technique.
Well, I think just from a schools perspective, I am able to, we haven't published it, but we can analyse based off different provinces as well. So that there are trends that we might see. We haven't dived into them just yet, but from an AIL perspective, we do a little bit in terms of the division 1A, 1B and 2.
Yeah, so the AIL is divided in 5 divisions, so you have 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, 2C. And we do have that comparison between the 1 and the 2. But obviously we have the data, and if that is something that wants to be looked at, like that is something we can easily do if we just like look at the different levels and if there is a difference in the conditions of the players and therefore more or less injuries.
Yeah, great. And just one last thing, just about, does the high incidence of injury, at elite level compared to the, amateur game, does that indicate that the pace of the game now has become so?
There's multiple components like faster, harder, stronger. If you compare, like, let's say an AIL prop with some of the South African props that won the World Cup, there is a slight difference there. So, that makes a difference
But the players that they're coming up against, the South African props are coming up against,
the equivalent, the English equivalent or the Kiwi equivalent. Yeah, so therefore more force is produced, it's faster, it's harder, and therefore the risk of injury and severity burden, everything is higher.
Yeah, despite the brilliance of your conditioning and everything
exactly.
else. Yeah, great. No, it was fantastic data. Excellent.
Thanks very much. We're going to hand over to Dr. John Mulvihill to look at concussion, and then Caithriona will tell us why this is all important for the IRFU. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tom. So apologies, I lost my voice yesterday. I've yet to find it, so this is going to be interesting. So I'm going to take a deeper dive into concussion after Laura gave us a great talk on concussion surveillance. But I'm going to get a little bit nerdy on what concussion is. So we're going to look at what happens inside in the brain, and ultimately we're going to answer the question of can we prognose concussion through science. So first I'm going to give you context of what concussion is, what happens inside in the brain, right? And then I'm going to show you the work that we've worked between IRIS, IRFU and Munster, and looking at the preliminary data from one of the seasons. So first up, what is concussion? We've talked about it already. I know, this is NFL, our brothers across the ocean there. And I will stop and I'll show you another one. Does anyone remember this one? We have yet to find this person, but they are a national hero. It's awful though, but that is quite severe. It can happen anywhere. We think of, this won't stop, so you're going to have to get used to it. So when we think of concussion, we think of sports, but it can happen anywhere to anyone, right? And it is something that we need to address. And this is what happens, right? You think this is what happens? I'm pretty sure everyone thinks, okay, you get this blow to the head and this reverberation within the brain. Question is that true? And we'll talk about that. So we'll answer whether this is true or not. And ultimately, should we prevent it? Should we diagnose it? Are these the right questions to be asking? But first, we'll look at what is actually happening here. What's worse is they're not the worst videos you'll see today. So I apologize. So this is the brain, right? This is what we think of when we think of the brain. There's 85 billion neurons in there, and this is one single neuron here, all healthy and all happy. But what happens is this thing that I say is happening. We get this impulsive force through the brain, and eventually that neuron will die, right? That is what happens, and it causes this cascade of symptoms. And we can profile those symptoms, but if we bring it back and simplify it, it's a force that causes cell death. That's what a concussion ultimately is. And when you do think of the brain, this is probably what you're thinking of. You've heard of grey matter and white matter, but is that true? Are they the only tissues inside in our brain? right? And I'm not going to ask you that question directly, but the answer is no. We have blood vessels, right? We need to supply blood to the brain. So if I took away all that grey and white matter, this is what's left behind, a dense network of vessels. And does that matter? Is that important? And that is important. Because brain matter, grey and white matter, it's like butter. It's very, very soft, but vessels are more like elastic bands. So when that thing that happens up here at the top, this reverberation, this impulsive force that goes through the brain, yes, the buttery substance wiggles around like jelly, but those vessels do not. What does that mean? What that means is you're causing shearing. The cells that are connected to those vessels tear. And when they tear, there's no longer blood supply. There's no longer a connection. And that's ultimately what causes this death here. This small shearing, this strain at a very small level causes cell death. And this is what happens. So this is one of the blood vessels here, and it's densely connected to all the neurons, astrocytes, all the cells within the brain. So when we do get a concussion, it's that shearing of those connections to the vessels. That's obviously a bad thing. So it's important for us to understand when a concussion is received, if there's a threshold, what is happening, how many of these cells are damaged, how many of these blood vessels are damaged, and what is that level when that happens. And this is actually just a slice of a person's brain, and you can actually see all the connections, all the blood vessels here, and the amount of cells that are connected to them. And I'm going to show you this again later. So I'm going to show you an anatomy of an impact. Right, so now that you know the basic premise, this is what happens during a concussion, we're going to look at, well, let's look at an impact. I'm going to show you first a boxing match, right? Why? Because the ultimate goal of a boxing match is to give someone a concussion. So we're just going to look at this black line here, and this is called translational acceleration. So just linear acceleration. So it's just the amount of acceleration. So from literally a full stop to a full acceleration. So this black line is what we're going to watch. And I'm going to play this video, and you're going to see the impact of this box, this particular hit here. So you can see this black line, right, is the culmination of all the accelerations in the different planes. And it happens very quickly. We're talking 5 milliseconds. This person does not get knocked out. Okay. Now I'm going to show you very slowly an impact in NFL. But I want you to notice this same black line, the same translational, and what happens here. What's the big difference? It's time. So it's the length of time of concussion that dictates how severe that person received a traumatic brain injury. And it's the length of time, it's the rate of the injury that's being applied as well. But the real question that I want to know is, well, what's happening inside in the brain? If we go back on a cellular level to what I talked about before, what happens between this injury and the previous injury? And what you're going to see here is a computational video. This is not my work, but this is work from the NFL hit that you just saw there. We're going to actually have a view of what happens inside in the brain. So red is bad. So here we are, this is over the whole length, and now you can see the amount of red within the brain. That is the amount of strain. So remember I talked about all the blood vessels being torn apart and all the cells tearing apart. This is where it occurs, just below what's called the falx cerebri here. That falx cerebri, you may not know, it's a fancy Latin term, but it's a tissue that divides the left and right hemisphere. So this tissue plays a really important role in dictating the location of a concussion, where all that damage occurs within the brain. So it's really important to know about this tissue. You'd imagine straight away, okay, well, we know a ton about this tissue because it's been known for years that it dictates the location of a concussion. And the answer to that question is unfortunately no. We know nothing about that tissue. But what's great from computational studies is we can know where within the brain, right? Again, this isn't my work, but it's work in Stanford, and they've located the common locations within the brain where a concussion, initiates. So we've got this buttery substance and this elastic band, and we've got locations of where this damage is occurring. And as I said, this tissue is really important. We should know a lot about it, and unfortunately, we don't. In fact, there's a call out there. It's I think a few years ago that asking, what is the falx cerebri? What is it made out of? And what is how stiff is it? And we here in UL were the first to do that. So this is where science comes in, because the falx cerebri, even though, as I said, it's incredibly important, we know again nothing about it. But what I'm going to talk to you about is not just the brain itself, but the tissues that surround the brain. Because that video I showed you earlier of the brain kind of sloshing around, is that true? So if we just, again, this is a bit of a busy image here. So we have the brain here, we have the skull over here, but you think there's nothing else in the brain, but there is. There's tissues in between the brain, and there's this space between the skull and the brain called the subarachnoid space. So there's actually lots of tissues in between, and they play an incredibly important role. And it's seen as a mechanically protective tissue, and they're called the meninges. Now, you may not have heard of what the meninges is, but you may have heard of what meningitis is. So meningitis is the inflammation of this tissue. So it protects and surrounds and engulfs the brain. So as I said, there is a disgusting video that I'm about to show you, so I apologize. So everyone thinks, right, we're looking at a picture of a brain here, right? And you are, but what's on the surface of that brain is not the brain. That's the meninges. Or dura mater, if you want to call it, to be specific. So what I'm about to show you in the next video is my PhD student. He's peeling away the meninges from the brain. So I do apologize. Here it is. So my terrible analogy of the meninges is that it's the lycra suit for your brain. It holds everything together. So this video, I do apologize. It's gone now. It's gone. So the question is this video true? It's not, because we have this protective suit around our brains. So if we go back to all this cell death and locations within the brain that cause a concussion, is it true when we don't include the meninges? So all those computational studies I showed you based it on studies without including the meninges. So how can we trust these computational studies? How can we trust our understanding of the meninges or where location occurs in concussion if we don't know anything about the tissue? And UL and our group were the first to characterize the falx cerebri, the superior sagittal sinus of this tissue, to try and improve our understanding of what happens in the brain during concussion. So just to quickly go ahead here, we were lucky to get tissue from the Dublin Brain Bank to characterize. So this is the meninges furled out here. I do apologize, everybody, but this is science. This is a bit yucky. So this is the meninges. My PhD student carried out a lot of different work. We literally physically pulled the tissue to understand how stiff it is, how it responds under conditions mimetic of concussion, and its important roles. We did a lot of different things. We were able to get the composition, what's inside in this tissue, how strong it is. It's no surprise, it's a very collagenous tissue. These are boring slides, but geez, I went ahead. So what I wanted to show you here is, and this is obviously quite technical here, but this is how stiff the tissue is, right? It's in what's called the megapascals, which is fine. But what does that compare against, let's say, the brain? The brain is in the kilopascals, and the skull is in the gigapascals. So we have this transitional tissue. This meninges plays an incredibly important role to protect our brain from a concussion. So this video you see up here is a lie. And it's probably, if you looked up concussion, that's probably the thing that you'd see first. So we played an important role there, and we're building up to where biomarkers come into all of this, because it's one thing to know about how strong or stiff these tissues are and what they're made out of. How do the cells respond? So that was our next step here, is to try and mimic what's going on in the brain during concussion. So when you go to sleep, right, all of the waste in your brain comes out, right? It flows all out of your brain, and that's why sleep is so important. And for someone who's 2 kids under 2, I get none of it. But this is what's hopefully happening in our wonderful brains at all times. Great, right? So there's flow. Actually, right now, there's flow going on in my brain. But when a concussion comes along, that flow changes completely. So we need to understand how a cell responds within the brain due to some sort of flow. I'm going to skip ahead here for a second. But this is work from one of my PhD students, Aisling Graney, and it just shows how our cells respond to change in stiffness. So in this case, we change the stiffness, how strong the material is that the cell is on, and we can see a change in the profile of the cells here. Again, we won't get too boring. But this is actually what's happening to our brains right now. Right now, this is hopefully what's happening to your brain right now. And you can see that pulsatile nature. So the movement of the flow within our brains is actually due to our respiratory system and our circulatory system. Great. So when a concussion comes along, all of that changes. All this flow profile changes within our brain. And so too, that must have an effect on the cells within. And why am I talking about this? Because if we can identify how a cell responds to this spike in change in flow, can we measure it? And if we can measure it, can we measure it in the blood of a patient? And that's where my focus of my work is going towards. But first, we need to know how these cells respond. So if we just look at what's highlighted in this little red box here, that's our subarachnoid space. It's the space that surrounds our brain here, and that plays a really important role. So when I said you go to sleep and all the waste drains out, that's where it's going to be draining out of. If you get a concussion or if you get if your brain expands in any way, you're going to block that space. So it's important to know how our cells respond to that. So we got some of the cells from the brain and the meninges. We carried out something that mimics that kind of flow, and we looked at, does it change the cells? So what you're looking at here is cells from the brain and the meninges here. All looks nice and exciting, but when you put flow on it, they change their shape. So what does that mean? If cells can change their shape to a very small flow, imagine what they're going to do when they get a concussive blow. And that's what we're trying to answer in our lab here. So we did a lot of interesting work. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what we looked at are markers. Can those cells tell us something? Can they tell us something is gone wrong? So if we look at this particular one here, we're seeing, okay, there's something going wrong here. Maybe this marker is telling us something that's gone wrong within the brain. And can we measure it in vivo? And that's where the next part of my work is. So can we get the cells to tell us what's going on? Because we can't ask our brains, is there something gone wrong? So our cells have to do that job for us. So can we prognose concussion? And notice the word prognose rather than diagnose. Because our clinical assessments are strong enough and robust enough to be able to diagnose a concussion. And really a player and even a person, what they want to know is, when can I return to play? When can I return to normal? Am I okay? And that's the answer that I hope this work can do. So taking on the knowledge that we got from the lab, understanding these cells, can we take blood from players and be able to probe them for those markers that we found in the lab? So what we did in August 2018 is we got pre-season samples. So it's important to have a control. So we got bloods from the players from Munster, thankfully not too far of a journey for us. And those same players throughout their season, and why we focus in on rugby is the HIA protocol. So we took 3 vials of their blood pre-season, we stored them in the Bernal, and we locked them away. And what we did is throughout the season, whenever a player received an injury that was on our, that had signed up to our study, what we were able to do is, as close to the injury as possible, take their blood again. 6 days post-injury, which is aligned with the return to play. And in 13 days post-injury, which is the average return for a concussion, not specific to rugby, but all types of sport. So what we get then is a profile. So we now have 4 time points. We have pre-season, post-injury, 6 days, 13. And what this allows us to do is map and see, okay, does that marker, the marker that the cell is telling us, is that within the blood, and does it go down? Does it go up? What actually happens? So there are, if you were to Google right now and look at markers for concussion, there's tons, right? There's the most common one is GFAP and UCHL1. They're actually FDA approved, and Abbott has a product on the market for diagnosis. But I want you to know and look at the numbers here, the detection time, 24 hours, 24 hours. So they're great, but after 24 hours, they're gone. So they're no good for prognosis. Right, so these are their kind of profiles. So after 24 hours, they're gone out of your blood system. They're no good for prognosis. So we had to go to the drawing board. So we did look at these markers, but we want to look at other markers here. So we looked at those FDA markers, but we also wanted to use machine learning to try and identify markers that could be prognostic. All right, so I have no idea how any of this works, but my colleague Kieran McGurty and his students were able to use machine learning methods from other data and other studies that are out there to identify markers that could be prognostic, ones that could stay in the blood after 13 days. So I'm going to show you what we were looking for. This is the perfect profile. You get an injury and you recover. Excellent. But this is a profile that could indicate an injury, right? That this marker goes up and stays up. Or a marker could go up and then go down below pre-season. And we can ask those questions because we have all those different time points within the blood. So I'm going to show you. On the left here is what the machine learning, this is our AI, let's say, generated over those same time points. So control, after injury, 6 days, and over 13 days. And this is that GFAP, FDA approved one. And on the right here is when we probed the players within Munster. And what we found is nothing, right? GFAP, as we predicted, was effectively no good for prognostic. So regardless of whether, how severe the injury was, GFAP just disappeared from the blood over time. UCHL1, there is a little bit of a change here in the players. And again, there's some sort of reduction from the AI generated work. And again, none of it worked. And it kind of proved our point. These FDA approved markers, great for diagnostics, terrible for prognostics. So what we asked the machine learning was, are there markers that fit the profiles that we were looking at? And it came up with, so far, 2, and we looked at what they were in the blood of players. So first one here, Kieran would kill me if I gave you what the actual marker was, so I can't. But this is what it predicted. So this is one of the profiles that we wanted. So it went up after injury and went down after time. And guess what? So within the players, we saw that spike and that drop. Not exactly what was predicted, but what it shows is using machine learning and in vivo data and understanding back in the lab that we can predict and find prognostic markers. And the second marker was quite good too, that it predicted that it would go up and stay down below baseline, and that's exactly what happened. It went up and went down below baseline. So instead of chasing what's out there for studies that are out there, by using machine learning, by understanding in the lab what we've done, understanding truly what concussion is, we can find markers that can be prognostic so that players and people can return to play. And that is me done. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, John. John's wealth of experience and knowledge is absolutely really adding to our Irish project and gives it depth as well. And lastly, just the last talk, and she was Dr. Caithriona Yeomans from the IRFU. And Caithriona's going to talk to us about the really important part of all this research. How does it translate into practice within the IRFU setting? So thank you, Caithriona.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be part of Research Week. It's really nice coming back down to UL. Even though after spending 4 years here, I did have to text Tom this morning and tell him that I was lost. So I hopefully will be able to find my way out again. So look, we've heard a lot today about the great work that Iris and the research team here are doing. And I suppose I want to put that in a little bit of context from my transition from research into a governing body or the real world, and how in the IRFU we try to translate that research into real world impact. And if we focus first of all on this word impact, okay? How do we create these kind of moments? My video is a little bit nicer than John's, hopefully. Yeah. So.
The point at which a drop ball becomes possible. Sexton waits, here it comes. It looks good. He likes it.
Okay. So, is this luck? Is this something that we can try and prepare for? Johnny was once asked, if he knew that when they looked at the time of the match, how many phases of play they'd been through, first match of the Six Nations, how fatigue would be affecting the players, the likelihood of a knock-on at one point, that his chance of sinking that drop goal was 3%. And they said, would you have still taken the kick? And he goes, damn hell I would. Okay. So, and this is what we try and see is why did he think that he had that shot on? And why in our context do we believe that even though the research may not, or the fact or the science may not back up what we know? And this is quite often the problem. So we have research where success is often measured by your outputs, your funding, your number of publications, and that's only right. That's how we should be looking at it. However, a lot of these projects are conducted in this controlled environment, this research bubble, where all of the different variables are accounted for and monitored, and we're looking for compliance in it. And how come whenever we step outside that bubble, we see that the effectiveness or the significance of findings suddenly starts to drop off? And that's because quite often the research hasn't considered the environment in which this is going to have to be translated into. So they don't understand the engagement, the atmosphere around it, the clinical or player expertise and experience that also will have an impact here. So if we think that content is king, okay, so that we all want to be evidence-based. Everyone always says, I want to be an evidence-based practitioner, I want to be evidence-based in my governing body. So to do that, we need data. So content is king, but context is King Kong, okay? We can't try and look at how that research is going to be impacted unless we understand the environment in which we're going to be trying to do this. And I think one of the things that we've worked really well between the IRFU and IRIS is trying to get that understanding and that relationship so that the content, the data, the findings can be translated into our context, so into our environment, and that's where we get this impact from. So in the IRFU, we have this research in real life approach, okay? So we want to try and look at how we embed research activities into our everyday practice. So I'm in the IRFU nearly 4 years now. When I started, I'd say 95% of the research projects that we were involved with were outside academics or universities approaching us to use our players as their sample, and they wanted to address what they measure success by. So they wanted to look at how many publications we can get out of this. We have a question that we think will benefit my master's student or my PhD student. And over that time, we've now switched where I'd say about 80% of projects in the IRFU are actually started by questions and conversations we're having, questions that we, like rugby, want answered, insight that rugby wants to gain, and we then approach outside academics to help us address that because we know that we need that partnership and that relationship there. And that's how we try and stay evidence-based but data-informed. We're not driven by the data, we're informed by it because we also understand the context that we're trying to work in. We still know that there's some things that you can't quite account for when you're outside your research bubble. And how this looks, now there's a very simplified graph of how research is looked at in the IRFU. We have a bunch of committees in the IRFU. We can't get enough committees. So our medical advisory committee oversee pretty much everything related to medical and science. And beneath that, we have our independent research advisory committee, and that's actually chaired by Professor Giles Warrington. And we have a number of outside academics who will be part of it, and then a number of internal staff who will also be on this committee. And over on the right-hand side of the screen for you guys, you'll see here that we have IRIS. So the work that IRIS does informs what we look at within our domestic game. So it informs our policy, it informs our programmes and our strategies that we want to look at. But you can see it's a two-way relationship. So in our rugby development, our domestic game committee, we would have our coaches, our referees, we have volunteer stakeholders, we have medical, we have players. So the questions that they're looking to answer, we'd feed into IRIS and look to them to help us address it. And this is mirrored by what we see in the high performance game with our performance support programme. So we're trying to keep those avenues open. I suppose where I sit in all of this, so I would have started off as a physio, so pitch side, and I've worked as a physio for nearly 14 years. And then at some stage I took the leap and decided to come down to UL and sit behind a PC for a number of years and entered into the world of academia. So as Tom said, I was the first PhD researcher through IRIS. When my PhD finished, I then joined the IRFU. So I said I've gone from pitch side to PC to policy. And I've stolen this word again from Giles as a pracademic, and I think my career path has helped me in my current role. So within the IRFU, part of my job is to look at how we interpret all the data and the findings and the literature and then make it suitable for the end user, because I've been the end user and I've also been the researcher on it, and now I'm trying to marry these two things together. So within IRIS and the IRFU in this relationship, I suppose there's two ways that we essentially work together. There's one way where we look at what the data is telling us, so what IRIS are monitoring each season. We use it to inform our robustness programme, we use it to inform our tackle behaviours trial, and also to inform our education strategies. And I'll talk through these in a little bit more detail in a moment. But I wanted to highlight that, as I said, it's not this one-way system, that we also then turn around and say, are we doing enough to support our coaches who are generally our end user within the domestic game? So as Lauren outlined for her PhD, we're like, we don't know if we're doing enough, and she's going to look and try and address that for us. We've had plenty of conversation within our women's game and our women's committee of, is breast health something that we should be looking at? Do players understand about supportive and protective clothing? And we approached UL, and they were very open to helping us answer this question, as Kilian has already outlined. And then finally, one of my bigger areas of interest is, what do players do when they're sitting out for 3 weeks of a mandated return to play time frame? And again, this was something that we had spoken about with UL and with UPMC, and this is where Laura's PhD comes into us now. So as I said, we have these questions that we want answered, but we know we don't have the resources or expertise necessarily to do it, so we come to look to those who can help us in these areas. As I said, I won't labour on too much here on this. I know there was a question earlier around the women's game and what more we can do to try and encourage I suppose buy-in into the project, and we're definitely open to suggestions if anyone has any that they want to come up and share with me afterwards. It is heavily incentivised, and we are looking at the structure of the women's competition. I think one of the problems with the women's competition for the last number of seasons is it hasn't been the same competition every single year. The structure has changed quite dramatically. So we're looking even at that competition structure to see if that can help us make sure that we have appropriate number of resources available to try and then partake in research. And similar, we had a question around non-medics using the system. One of the things that we do is have safe rugby training courses, so it's our pitch side first aid courses, and these are one of the incentives of being part of IRIS is if you're a medic, you can do a safe level 2 free of charge, and if you're a non-medic, we will come and do safe level 2 training in your club or school for as many non-medics as you like. So we are trying to encourage that education as well and upskilling for those involved, but it's work in progress and a lot still to be done. So as I said, I'm going to talk through these kind of 3 key ones now here. So our robustness strategies, how we reduce injury risk, and how do we manage injuries appropriately. And if we look at this readiness and robustness programme, and we're really specific in that term, readiness and robustness, we're trying to move away from using terms like warm-up and injury prevention, because in our environment, we're talking about performance. The coaches want the players on the field, the players want to be on the field, the referees want to make sure that 30 players get on and off the field okay. So we need to come to them and speak their language to get their buy-in and compliance. Now, as a physio, we're a little bit obsessed with injuries, and to me it's logical that if your players are injured, they're not on the pitch and therefore your performance is affected. But sometimes, if you're not coming from a medical point of view, you don't see that link necessarily. So if we come to a coach and say, we're going to get your players ready, we're going to get them robust, and it's not going to be 15 minutes at the start of training, you can integrate it to be part of your training, we hope that that will encourage that buy-in and interest in doing it. But what is robustness? So robustness is the ability to consistently engage in training and games with maximal effort. Okay? And I think that's really important. When we're talking about performance, we want that consistency to be part of training and games. Do we mind, if we wanted Johnny to have an injury-free season, we wouldn't have put him out playing against France, okay? But instead, we want to try and create players who are able to meet the demands of rugby so that we can create moments of magic like we watched earlier. And when we think about robustness, it covers various risk factors, non-modifiable factors, modifiable factors, and quite often when you look at the literature around this area, you'll see that a lot of projects will pick one area that they're really interested in and they'll look at that in isolation. And then another project will look at another area in isolation, and then they'll say, well, if this is this finding and this is this finding, then maybe they work together. And what we're trying to do with IRIS and how we roll out Engage is trying to look at this as the whole. So trying to see what are all the factors we can look at within the context. So within some of those non-modifiable things that we have to be aware of, but we may not be able to address individually. And how that came about, I suppose, within the IRFU, we'd been looking at the injury trends for a number of seasons, and we were noticing that the shoulder, the knee, the ankle, the head and concussion were coming up season on season. And we were like, well, okay, so we want to create something that will address those areas because they seem to be the big heavy hitters for us. So then we worked with IRIS and our PhD past scholar, Dr. Patrick Dolan, to develop Engage and to see how we roll it out. So again, trying to work with them around, we had the content, now we want the context of how that can be implemented across a wider cohort, so across all levels of the domestic game. And then Patrick would have researched the acceptability, appropriateness, feasibility, the user friendliness, I suppose, of Engage within the club game, and now Lauren's going to expand on that into the schools game. And it'll be really interesting to see how we get that buy-in and compliance through that, or what we can do differently with it. The other one that we want to talk about is a little bit is this tackle behaviours trial, as I said, which is hopefully most people have heard about it at some point. And one of the things that, again, we know from IRIS is that concussion tends to be the most common injury across the game. And we can see that it was occurring mostly in the tackle event. We also then looked wider at the literature, so what else we could notice, and we were seeing that, well, there's different types of tackles lead to different types of injuries, and there's a bigger risk of head impact when your tackle is up high, so above the level of the shoulder. There's also a risk of a head impact when it's from the hip downwards, kind of more of an orange zone. If we think this is the red zone, this is the orange zone. And there's a kind of a sweet spot in the middle, so that below the lower line of the sternum, or that like belly tackle, where there's less risk of a head impact occurring. So we're not going to be reducing or preventing injuries totally, but we can reduce that risk. So we're in the middle of this trial now, so we've just completed our first season at the lower tackle height, and we are part of World Rugby's global trial, where there are 11 different unions, all with slightly different takes on where they want to place the tackle line, and also what they do in and around things like the ball carrier behaviour and pick and go. But we'll be part of this process, particularly in terms of the video analysis with them, to see if we can understand what the data is trying to tell us. Because obviously we'll have IRIS data pre and post, and we're probably one of the luckiest unions to be able to do that. A lot of other unions are only trying to set up their injury surveillance alongside changing the tackle height. So we're in a really, really lucky position here. We'll also have the stakeholder feedback. So Dara Kern, who's joined the IRIS project to look at this and help us out with the qualitative analysis on this. And then that video bit to try and understand if what we're seeing holds true in terms of what the stakeholders feel, and also what the injury data is telling us. And as I said, this was going to be for a minimum of 2 seasons, so it'll be interesting to see where we go from that afterwards. And then finally, I suppose the other way that we use IRIS data, so we would look at the most common injuries season on season, and this informs the content of our Safe Rugby courses. So we do try and adjust it every season to see, well, if shoulders are becoming more problematic in schools, when we're going to do a Safe Rugby course in schools, maybe we will talk about how to recognise a shoulder dislocation. If you're not a medic, this is what your management should be of that, to get them over to someone who can relocate it. And I suppose that's a huge, big win for us. We changed our guide to concussions and our graduated return to play protocol this season. So this was following obviously the Amsterdam consensus statement that Laura mentioned earlier. One of the big things, again, helping out with that IRIS data of where our most common injuries are, and where we want to try and create that robustness for players. We looked at the old graduated return to play protocol, and if any of you are familiar with that, it was very much geared around aerobic fitness. It was 6-stage protocol to get you back to aerobic fitness. There was nothing around when you can start lifting in the gym, when you can start doing balance training, when you could even attempt a tackle. So we've now added in a few extra competencies, so it's a quite comprehensive protocol. But we're trying to, again, make sure that we're aligning the rehab from a concussion along how you would align rehab for an injury. So if someone's strained their hamstring, you don't tell them to go rest for 3 weeks and then put them out in the middle of a match. You will have goals for them, you will have steps along that way, and that's what we're trying to get to with concussion. And if you can see, it's probably a little bit hard to see up there, all the exercises that are contained in the graduated return to play protocol align with the exercises that we have in Engage. So if you think about Engage, we're trying to reduce their risk of injury by addressing these areas of injury or most common injury. We then, if someone does get a concussion, we obviously are bringing them back through exercises and protocol that they should be familiar with. And then also one of the new big parts of this, and this lines up with our tackle behaviours trial, is how to return to the tackle safely. So again, breaking down the tackle into 4 different stages for our tackle competencies to make sure that the player is most able to go back to that. And the reason or the thinking behind that is, if the tackle is the place that they're most getting the injury, particularly a concussion from, we need to make sure that we're addressing any deficits in their tackle technique, any inconsistencies that they've had, so that when they go back, they're not going to get another concussion or another injury once they return to play. So all of these 3 programs have very similar content. We're just selling it in different ways depending on what player you're dealing with. And I suppose this is just where I want to finish off. If we want to make sure that your research is impactful. So if you're thinking about your own projects and you want to make sure that you're having that real world impact, you need to understand the environment, the context in which you are going to be implementing it. You need to be talking to your end users, understanding their experiences, their level of expertise, their commitment or compliance or buy-in to these projects before you start thinking about the content, okay? Because you could have the best content, the best data out there, but if you don't actually know how to speak to your end user, it's not going to be impactful, okay? And I'm happy to take any questions.
I know we're just touching at 11 o'clock, but if anyone has any quick questions you want to ask us, you might fire away, or we'll be here afterwards if you want to come down and have a chat or anything. Darragh.
I have two for John. I was wondering, your markers, you obviously can't tell us. Sorry. So I'm Darragh, I'm Tom's new PhD student, I'm a lecturer at the school that I tell. I was wondering, you can't tell us what the markers are obviously, but are they immunological or is it like markers of cellular debris? What kind of stuff is?
No comment. I'm only joking. That's a really good question. I could talk for hours on it. So, remember I showed you the cells attaching to the vessels, right? We have a thing called the blood-brain barrier. For anyone in pharmacology, it's a really annoying thing because you can't get drugs into the brain. There are a couple of things that are really good at getting into the brain, such as caffeine and alcohol. All right, but it's actually really difficult to get anything else in. But when your blood-brain barrier opens up, all these things flood out. But when your blood-brain barrier closes, what are you measuring anymore? Like, can these markers get in? So the ones I'm looking at are markers that can get into the system without having to go through the blood-brain barrier, and that's key. Because when that closes, so too does the markers. But I still haven't answered your question.
I have one more, if that's all right. Years ago, and this may have progressed way beyond that, I remember reading about creatine and potentially being used as a protective mechanism in TBI. I was wondering what systems that affected or if that had even fleshed out.
As a preventative?
Yeah, or potential preventative.
I genuinely have heard of that, but I honestly don't know the mechanisms that would improve or protect. I've never actually looked into it. Yeah. Good question.
Sorry, I'll just jump in there. So we, some of our nutritionists did do a lot of research on creatine, and it does seem to have a good protective benefit for brain health in general, not necessarily TBI. So apparently we should all be taking creatine as appropriately advised. So we have introduced it as part of our concussion management protocol with our elite players. So following a concussion, they almost get a concussion pack with some information around it, and they would go back to a loading dose of their creatine and then taper back down to their regular dose of creatine. And we're looking to see how that will affect their return to play timeframes.
Cool. Good stuff. Thanks very much. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Norley.
Yeah. Thanks for a really interesting session. I only came in kind of halfway through, but what I've listened to has been fantastic. Thank you very much. And Caithriona, thanks for making the point about impact. The whole rationale for Research Week is, again, to show the range of work we have and the impact. So thank you all very much for that. John, two quick questions. When you showed the lovely video of removing the meninges from the brain, how do you account for the change, I suppose, from the living brain to the cadaveric brain, and I suppose accounting for what you're looking at in the meninges in that? And then the second thing is a little bit more like was asked about the biomarkers. And I know you can't reveal and won't reveal, but I suppose how do you, in a prognostic context, think about other injuries that might be leading to the increase in those biomarkers in that time frame? And I'm only asking that because you had something like IL-6 up, and I'm wondering about those inflammatory markers that might be from other for other reasons in the body, post-injury as well as just post-exercise. Just wondering how your machine learning, but don't give me the specifics, I want to understand them. How do you account for all of those? Yeah,
no, so for the first question, yeah, it's a big problem with biological tissue in general. You're getting tissue from cadavers. And especially with the meninges, because once you pass away, that subarachnoid space, the pressure within your brain goes away. To the point at which I showed 3 layers in the meninges, but just last year someone discovered a 4th layer, and it's because we can't literally see what's going on in there. So no, you don't get everything, and it's not a perfect example. 2, with the markers, absolutely. So that's why I don't like GFAP and UCHL1, because GFAP is an indicator for glaucoma. So having robust controls is the key to that. So I didn't show it there, but we'd have age-matched controls who'd go through exercise as well. Because what if that marker goes up because you just ran for a while? It's about robust controls, and it's not just a problem with what I'm doing, but with all biomarkers in general is there's other diseases that go up. So absolutely. Cheers.
Okay, thanks very much. We've gone past 11, so thanks to everyone for coming today, and I hope you enjoy your long weekend. Thanks everyone.